There's a photograph Ivana Trump waited 4 decades to release into the world. April 1977. On one side, Fred and Mary Ann Trump. On the other, Ivana's father and her aunt. Between them, the bride, dressed in white. 2 families brought together. That's what the image shows. Here's what it leaves out. Before that ceremony ever took place, Ivana had already put her signature on a contract written by Roy Cohn. One early draft demanded she surrender every gift her husband had ever given her the moment the marriage ended. She fought that clause and reworked the whole agreement 4 separate times over the years. And the single most damning line ever attributed to her mother-in-law wasn't really about Ivana at all. It was about the mother-in-law's own son. That line first appeared in September 1990, inside Marie Brenner's Vanity Fair account of the Trump marriage falling apart. According to Brenner, Donald's mother had turned to Ivana and asked what kind of son she'd raised. 7 words, endlessly repeated for 35 years, as evidence of a frosty Scottish matriarch who never accepted the Czech girl from Queens by way of Zlín. Look again, though. That's not a woman expressing contempt for her daughter-in-law. That's a mother staring at her son's public behavior and failing to recognize him. If anything, it places Mary Ann McLeod Trump firmly in Ivana's corner. So where did this idea of the hostile mother-in-law actually come from? It came from the same source almost everything we think we know about that marriage came from. It passed through Ivana's own circle, at precisely the moment she was fighting for her financial survival. And that's the real story here. Not whether an 88-year-old woman from the Isle of Lewis secretly disliked her daughter-in-law, something no surviving document can settle either way, but what happened to a woman who married into a family with no real place for wives, and what she did in response. Start with what Ivana already understood before she ever laid eyes on a Trump. She was born Ivana Zelničková in 1949 in what was then Gottwaldov, a factory town renamed for a communist president, in a country where getting out was the single hardest thing a person could accomplish. Her father, Milos, an electrical engineer, put her on skis early and pushed her hard. She had talent, enough to compete, enough to travel. And in that system, travel meant everything. It was currency. It was the way out. Ivana found her exit the way a pragmatic person would. In 1971, she married an Austrian ski instructor, Alfred Winkelmeyer. That marriage granted her an Austrian passport, a document that let her leave Czechoslovakia and still return home to see her parents without being labeled a defector. She's never hidden this. 2 years later, with Winkelmeyer teaching in California, she secured a divorce in absentia in Los Angeles. Sit with that for a moment because it explains everything that followed. Before she turned 25, Ivana had already used a marriage as a legal tool, carried it out cleanly, and dissolved it without incident. To her, a wedding was paperwork with a function. So when Roy Cohn pushed a prenuptial agreement across a table in 1977, he wasn't dealing with a naive young woman encountering the idea of contractual romance for the first time. He was dealing with the one person in the room who'd already been through this exact process once before. There's a complicated thread in her family history that only surfaced years later, worth mentioning because it shows how little of this life ever stayed private. Czech secret police files reported on by The Guardian and other outlets suggest that Milos Zelničková was recruited as an informant for the STB, relaying information his daughter shared with him from New York, including, at one point, a forecast about the 1988 American presidential election. There's nothing to indicate Ivana was aware of this. But the woman who would later be accused of leaking her own marriage to the tabloids had grown up in a household where information traveled upward whether anyone wanted it to or not. By the mid-1970s, she was modeling in Montreal, living with a fellow Czech skier named George Siravatka. In the summer of 1976, she traveled to New York with a group of models, swept up in the promotional wave surrounding the Montreal Olympics. She was 27. Donald Trump was about to turn 30. At that point in his life, he was almost pure potential. The Grand Hyatt deal hadn't closed. Trump Tower existed only as an idea. What he possessed was his father's fortune, his father's connections across Brooklyn and Queens politics, and Roy Cohn's phone number. What followed was Donald operating at full capacity. He secured her a table at a restaurant she and her friends couldn't get into on their own. He covered the bill. He arranged a car to take her home. Roses arrived the next morning. Weeks later came a trip to Montreal. Then she was back in New York, being chauffeured around in a car bearing his initials as plates. Understand what each of them was actually gaining here, because this wasn't a romance novel. He was acquiring a European woman with athletic accomplishments, genuine work ethic, real instincts for design, and an accent that read as sophistication to people who didn't know better. She was acquiring Manhattan, and a man who, by every account from that time, worked relentlessly and never touched alcohol, which, to a woman raised amid heavy drinking and limited horizons, meant something. He also pursued her aggressively. Ivana said in interviews decades later that for months he insisted she'd regret it forever if she didn't marry him. That's her memory, offered at 70, after a lifetime spent shaping her own narrative, and it deserves to be taken with some skepticism. But the timeline backs up the sense of urgency. They met in summer, and they were married before the following Easter. Somewhere along the way, he brought her to Jamaica Estates to meet his parents. The house on Wareham Place was large for Queens standards and completely unremarkable by Manhattan ones, a solid brick colonial with white columns, home to a man of substantial wealth who never once carried himself like it. Fred Trump wore a suit and tie to inspect boiler rooms personally. Harry Hurt III, writing in 1993, described Mary Ann gathering loose change from the laundry machines in the family's apartment buildings. Versions of that particular story have been told about several Trump women over the years, so treat the detail itself loosely. But the underlying truth holds firm. This was a household where wealth was tallied quietly, never flaunted. Into that world came Ivana, who would eventually sell her own jewelry line on television. Mary Ann MacLeod was 64 that year. She had come from Tong, a Gaelic-speaking village on the edge of Scotland's Isle of Lewis, arriving in New York in 1930 with almost nothing to her name. She married Fred in 1936. Their reception held 25 guests at the Carlyle. They honeymooned briefly in Atlantic City and returned straight to work. Now set that against what her son did within 9 months of meeting a woman. The wedding took place in the first week of April 1977 at Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue, with Norman Vincent Peale officiating. The Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking, essentially mid-century America's celebrity pastor. Hundreds of guests attended. The reception followed at the 21 Club. Newspapers covered it extensively. This wasn't two families quietly merging. This was a launch. And before any of that happened, there was the contract. In March 1977, roughly 6 months into their relationship, Ivana sat down to negotiate a prenuptial agreement drafted by Roy Cohn, McCarthy's former counsel, a lawyer with mob ties, Trump's personal fixer, the man who taught Donald never to settle and never to apologize. One clause required Ivana to return every piece of jewelry Donald had given her should the marriage dissolve. She reportedly stood up and walked out over that provision. In a 1990 deposition, she said the clause had hurt and confused her. She couldn't understand why gifts received during the marriage would revert back to the man who'd given them. She also asked for a financial cushion, $150,000 as insurance, reasoning that she was giving up her own career prospects. She settled for $100,000. The jewelry clause was removed. Donald blamed his lawyer for it. Here's the part most retellings skip entirely. She didn't just sign the document and move on. In 1979, she reopened negotiations and raised her divorce settlement to $750,000. She reopened it again in 1984, and once more in 1987. 4 versions across a decade. each one tracking the growth of his fortune. Nearly every account of this marriage treats that prenup purely as a restraint on Ivana. But it was also the one asset in that entire family a wife was actually permitted to negotiate. And Ivana negotiated it repeatedly, always upward, for 10 straight years. Keep that in mind, because by 1990, it becomes the very thing she fights hardest against, and the thing that comes closest to destroying her. She had married into something closer to a corporation that happened to serve dinner. Fred sat at the head of the table well into his 80s. His money continued funding things long after his children had grown up. Fred decided effectively what it meant to be a Trump. Donald would later give his mother credit for his flair for spectacle, writing in The Art of the Deal that he inherited some of his showmanship from her. And that's true as far as it goes. But Mary Ann's version of showmanship played out at charity luncheons with the Women's Auxiliary at Jamaica Hospital. She raised 5 children. She drove a Rolls-Royce with her initials on the plates and held equity in nothing. That was the world Ivana had just entered. Wives in that family were essentially staff who dressed better. She became pregnant almost immediately. Donald Jr. arrived on the final day of 1977, less than 9 months after the wedding. And within a few years, Ivana was on construction sites, hard hat over heels, clipboard in hand, overseeing interior design first at the Grand Hyatt and then at Trump Tower. She had no intention of fading into the background, which is exactly when the family's discomfort with her started. It wasn't that she was foreign or glamorous or ambitious in some abstract sense. The real issue was that she began generating her own headlines. Through the first half of the 1980s, the Trumps were arguably the most photographed couple in New York, and those photographs were doing genuine work. He handed her real authority, a detail often reduced to a punchline, but it wasn't one. In 1985, Ivana became president of Trump's castle in Atlantic City, overseeing a casino with roughly 4,000 employees, a figure she cited herself and no one has ever disputed. She was the only woman running a casino anywhere at that level. 3 years later, he moved her to the Plaza Hotel after acquiring it, and in 1990 she was named Hotelier of the Year. Here's how he framed the arrangement to reporters, repeatedly in public. He paid his wife $1 a year, plus all the dresses she wanted. It got laughs every time. It was also, in practical terms, an accurate summary of her legal standing. She was running 2 of his largest properties and owned none of them. Her compensation reduced to a line item in a prenuptial agreement she had to keep updating just to stay current with his net worth. Ivana wasn't naive about any of this. She was using the exposure deliberately. By the mid-1980s, according to Marie Brenner, she had reached the point of handing journalists a personal press kit stuffed with her own favorable coverage. Consider what that represents. The wife in a family that had spent 50 years cultivating obscurity in Queens was actively curating her own media file. That was the real friction point. Not her accent, not her spending, her byline. Now, Palm Beach, spring of 1986. The Trumps had recently purchased Mar-a-Lago, Marjorie Merriweather Post's 118-room estate, and were hosting dinners for a Palm Beach social establishment still deciding whether to find them amusing. Donald announced what he called an old custom at a house he'd owned for only a few months. Guests would stand and introduce themselves like attendees at a sales conference. Ivana was seated at the far end of a long table. Brenner was present that night, and her observation became the single most quoted description of the marriage's interior, published 4 years later in September 1990, that the 2 of them never appeared to touch or exchange anything intimate in public, that they'd come to resemble ambassadors from 2 different countries, each working a separate agenda. That was 1986. The peak. The year Donald appeared on television offering to negotiate arms control with the Soviets. The year people floated his name for president. The gap between the public image of that marriage and its private reality had already opened up a full 5 years before the country found out. By then they had two more children, Ivanka in 1981, Eric in 1984, and Ivana ran that part of life the same way she ran everything else, on a strict schedule, with nannies and rules and breakfast served without fail. She said plainly that she raised them alone, that Donald was consumed by deal-making, that he didn't know how to talk to small children and only grew interested once they turned 21. Neither her children nor Donald himself have disputed any of it. So by 1988 the picture was this: a marriage functioning like a business, a wife extremely capable at running that business, a husband increasingly over-leveraged and beginning to come apart, and absolutely no mechanism within that family for either of them to acknowledge any of it out loud. Then came Marla Maples. The affair began around 1985 or 1986, depending on whose account you trust, and it was hardly discreet. People working the Atlantic City casinos talked about it openly afterward. One trade journal editor recalled Maples spending a summer aboard the Trump Princess yacht, only to be moved off whenever Ivana was expected. That's second-hand recollection from an industry with its own interests, so it should be weighed carefully. But the broader pattern of a mistress operating within the same social and professional geography as the wife is backed by enough independent sources to take seriously. Ivana's own account of discovering the affair is the version most people know, and it's worth noting. We only have it because she chose to include it in her 2017 memoir, 4 decades after the wedding. Aspen, December 1989. The family was on a ski trip. A young blonde woman approached her on the mountain, told her she loved Ivana's husband, and asked whether Ivana did too. Ivana's reply, in her own retelling, "Get lost. I love my husband." She added in print that the moment felt unladylike, that she was in shock. She wrote that she knew right then it was over. She didn't behave like a woman who believed it was finished. She behaved like a woman with 8 weeks to prepare. In February 1990, the Chicago Tribune reported that Donald had Ivana locked out of her own office at the Plaza. Not gradually pushed aside, but locked out. The president of the hotel, the reigning hotelier of the year, arrived at the building she managed and couldn't get through the door. That's the exact moment the marriage stopped functioning as a marriage and became a legal battle. And what they fought over was the prenup. Ivana's attorneys went after all 4 versions, arguing the entire agreement should be voided. Donald's side maintained that a deal signed 4 separate times was still a deal. This is where her decade of careful renegotiation worked against her. Every time she'd reopened the agreement and accepted an updated version, she'd also demonstrated that she understood it, negotiated it with legal counsel, and agreed to its terms. Cohn himself had died in 1986 of AIDS, but the paperwork he built outlived him and performed exactly as designed. Meanwhile, the tabloids tore into the family without mercy. The New York Post ran its infamous headline connecting Marla to the marriage's collapse, arguably the single most recognizable artifact to emerge from the entire divorce, and one no one has ever definitively traced back to Maples herself. It hit newsstands in February 1990, in every borough where Fred Trump owned real estate. That's the backdrop for the remark at the center of this entire story. Sometime that year, according to Brenner's reporting, Marianne Trump turned to her daughter-in-law and asked what kind of son she had raised. She was 78 years old. Her husband's health was failing. Her eldest son, Freddie, had died in 1981 at age 42, a loss the family had never really addressed openly. And now her second son's mistress was splashed across the cover of the Post. The remark reaches us secondhand. It came to a magazine journalist through reporting heavily sourced from Ivana's own side at the exact moment Ivana needed public sympathy to strengthen her negotiating position. None of that makes the quote false. Brenner was a credible journalist, and her piece has aged better than most Trump-era reporting from that period. But it does mean the only surviving sentence describing how Donald's mother felt during her son's divorce came to us filtered through the divorcing wife's own publicity machine, which is an odd way to establish that a mother-in-law despised her. Now to the hardest part of this record, addressed once and then set aside. In a 1990 divorce deposition, Ivana described an incident from 1989 in which she stated her husband had assaulted her. That deposition was sealed. Harry Hurt III later obtained the account and published it in his 1993 book. Before the book's release, Ivana issued a statement, printed within the book itself, clarifying that while she'd used that word during the deposition, she hadn't meant it in a literal or criminal sense. She repeated that clarification in 2015 when the story resurfaced during Trump's presidential campaign, describing it instead as a moment of extreme tension during the divorce. Donald Trump has denied the entire account, including the surgery she said preceded it. Those are the facts as documented, two statements from the same woman, years apart, pointing in different directions, one of them made while she was still bound by an agreement dictating what she could say about him publicly. Draw your own conclusions. What can't reasonably be done is treat the record as clean-cut. October 1990. Ivana's father, Miloš, died suddenly of a heart attack in Czechoslovakia. He was 63. Donald Trump got on a plane and stood beside his estranged wife at her father's funeral in Zlín that November, in the middle of one of the ugliest divorces in the country, while their respective lawyers continued tearing into each other back in New York. Don't romanticize that gesture, and don't dismiss it either. Both realities are documented. He was capable of showing up. He was also, within weeks, back to fighting her over money. The divorce was finalized in December 1990 on grounds of cruel and inhuman treatment. The financial settlement took longer to resolve and ultimately delivered roughly $14 million, the Greenwich estate, an apartment at Trump Plaza, and the right to use Mar-a-Lago 1 month each year. A clause worth noting because it meant she kept a key to the very house where Brenner had witnessed the marriage disintegrate. The settlement also carried a confidentiality provision. Ivana couldn't discuss the marriage or the divorce without his permission, but she'd spent her entire adult life understanding a contract as merely a starting point, not an ending. In 1992, she published a novel, For Love Alone, about a Czech woman who marries a wealthy American and is ultimately betrayed by him. Fiction, legally speaking. Donald sued her for $25 million, arguing the novel violated the confidentiality clause. She had found the one loophole the agreement never quite closed, and he was forced into court arguing that a fictional story about a fictional husband was somehow really about him. Then she did something the family apparently found unforgivable. She went on television and started selling things. House of Ivana launched on HSN out of Tampa, then moved to QVC in London, then to the Shopping Channel in Canada. Clothing, perfume, jewelry. She's claimed tens of millions in sales, a figure that's hers alone and unaudited, though the volume was clearly substantial enough that she kept at it for 2 decades. Consider what that meant within the family she'd married into. Fred Trump built apartment buildings across Brooklyn and collected rent from them. Mary Ann volunteered at Jamaica Hospital. The entire Trump family structure, spanning 3 generations, rested on owning the ground beneath something tangible. Ivana went on cable television at 2 p.m. and sold costume jewelry to strangers, using a surname the family considered exclusively theirs. She also appeared on Oprah repeatedly, giving interviews freely. In 1991, Donald cut off her payments following one such appearance and threatened to sue her for damages. She returned to that same show in 1992 and declared on camera that she would no longer let men dominate her. Then, in 1996, she cemented herself in cultural memory in roughly 9 seconds of screen time. In the First Wives Club, playing herself, she told a room full of discarded wives not to get mad, to get everything. That single line is now more famous than any property she ever helped design. It's effectively her monument. A woman who ran a casino and a hotel across 3 of Donald Trump's major properties is best remembered for one piece of divorce advice, delivered as herself, playing herself, on purpose. Meanwhile, the woman at the heart of this whole story was withdrawing from public life entirely. On Halloween night 1991, Mary Ann Trump was mugged on Union Turnpike near her home by a 16-year-old who knocked her down and stole her purse, containing $14. She suffered broken ribs and a brain hemorrhage, with lasting damage to her vision and hearing.